Okay. So hi everyone. Thank you for inviting me here tonight. My name's Alicia and I work on the Welsh Beaver Project. I'm going to be talking about the return of beaver, mainly to Wales, but I'm going to give an overview of what's been happening in Britain. But I'm going to sort of take you back to basics. I'm going to start with beaver ecology and then go through sort of why I want to bring beavers back, look at some case studies, and then end on what's been happening sort of more closer to home. So just as an overview, the Welsh Beaver Project is an all-Wales project. It's run sort of on behalf of the Wildlife Trust in Wales. So I'm based with Ranishire Wildlife Trust, but I'm actually employed by North Wales Wildlife Trust because I work right across Wales, which is why I'm sort of based in the middle. So I'm sometimes in the south, sometimes in the north, and occasionally I'm allowed across the border into England to help with some beaver projects on the border with Shropshire Wildlife Trust and Staffordshire Wildlife Trust. My main role is looking at sort of trying to bring beavers back to Wales and learning to sort of live alongside them. So our project is project funded, so every now and again we have to apply for funding. At the moment we're currently funded by Heritage Lottery Fund, and that sort of ends end of this month, and so we're sort of looking for future funding to keep us going. But so that's sort of an overview. Just a bit of a plea really. I do have some participant surveys. They're on the sort of the table in front. I'd be really grateful if you could fill these in sort of after the talk. It's just to give feedback on the talk, and it's basically for our project evaluation, for our project funders. So any sort of feedback is greatly received because it can potentially help with future funding, and if you're running future events as well, anything we can sort of improve on or anything you'd like us sort of to see in terms of future events. That aside, so just to start with basics really. So you've seen a couple of videos on beavers, but what are they? Well, there's only two species of beaver in the world. So we have the North American beaver, Castor canadensis, and then we have the Eurasian beaver, Castor fiber. And as you can see from the slide, the Eurasian beaver is actually the older of the two species. It's over 15 million years old, and it's thought that the Eurasian beaver managed to get over to North America by the land bridge, by the Bering Strait, and then eventually over time through geographical isolation, the North American beaver came to be what it is today. So it's thought the Eurasian beaver moved over to North America around 7 million years ago, and about 2 million years ago we have sort of the rise or the North American beaver sort of being what it is today. And along the way, as you can tell, they've lost some chromosomes along the way, from 48 chromosomes with the Eurasian beaver down to 40 chromosomes with the North American beaver. So with that, they're actually genetically different species. So if they were to ever meet either in the wild or in captivity, they can't interbreed. So they're genetically two different species. They look very similar, but genetically they are different. This is the historical distribution of the Eurasian beaver. So with the North American beaver, as the name suggests, it's found across North America, and that's from Canada, United States of America to northern Mexico, and this is the distribution of the Eurasian beaver, and here onwards I'll be mainly talking about the Eurasian beaver. So the red shading is where Eurasian beavers used to be found, so very widespread right across Europe and even going into Mongolia and China as well. The blue shading is where beavers haven't been found, so there's no records of beavers ever being found in Ireland, and very few records from southern Europe. In terms of southern Europe, the climate is just a bit too warm for them, whereas sort of the rest of Europe, more temperate conditions is where they're found. And so we know beavers are native across Europe and closer to home here in Britain because the amount of evidence that has been compiled. So with beavers, we're actually extremely lucky with the amount of evidence that is out there. So these two books are really sort of good reference points if you want to find out more about beavers in Britain. They're written by Bryony Coles, who was a professor of archaeology at the University of Exeter, and she spent a majority of her career looking at beaver evidence. So a lot of her work took her across Northern Europe. In terms of what she's found in Britain, and particularly in Wales, it's very wide-ranging. So the very first written record of beavers in Wales actually dates back to 980 AD. Then we have accounts like this one from Gerald Cambrensis in a journey through Wales. He was an archdeacon of Brecon, and he sort of spent a lot of times on pilgrimage right across Wales, and he encountered lots of wildlife along the way, and beavers were one of them. And so this account that he wrote was, "The Teivi of all the rivers in Wales and those in England south of the Humber is the only river where you can find beavers. In Scotland also, they tell me, there is again only one stream where beavers live, and even then they're extremely rare." So even back then, it's looking like beavers were becoming rare. It's possible that they actually hung on into many more rivers than his accounts tell us, because there has been some evidence of them clinging on to a few more river systems, possibly river systems that are isolated and difficult to get to. But it does show that there was sort of first-hand evidence of people actually seeing beavers. Then we have fossil remains. So down here, these are remains that have been found in various places, so lots of jewel remains. Quite a few have been found in the caves in northern Wales. We have ancient beaver Nord sticks. There's been quite a few found in southern Wales, but also areas across England as well. And some of these have even been found in association with Bronze Age sites. So it's thought that humans may have been moving into beaver sites because you've got some nice cut wood already, so ideal for making your homes, even making causeways. They've been found sort of laid down in causeways and in ancient sites, and even for firewood as well, some nicely cut sticks. You don't have to bother trying to cut a tree down yourself. And so that's really interesting, the association, even going back thousands of years, beavers with humans. And then we have place names as well. There's lots of place names, particularly in England, places like Beverley, Beaver Brooks, or all associations with beavers being in those areas. And then in Wales, we have quite a few place names, as you can see, from north, south, and mid Wales, that has a vanc in the name, and a vanc is one of the Welsh words for beaver. So the place names in North Wales and mid Wales, the translation is Beaver Brook, and then down in Pembrokeshire, there's an area called Grave of the Beaver, Grave of the Evanc. I don't think there is a beaver buried in that area, but there's lots of myths surrounding beavers and going back over hundreds and hundreds of years. So there is some mythology around, but maybe there were beavers in those areas as well. So all these different things combined show that beavers were very widely distributed. And if we do stick with the Evanc and folklore, you wouldn't want to be out on a dark night, particularly in a river, because this is what it might have looked like. So the Evanc in sort of Welsh mythology is basically a water monster, and there's various descriptions from a giant beaver, a crocodile, or even some kind of hybrid between a crocodile and a beaver. So pretty fierce looking, known to flood towns and feed on people. So maybe that's where some of the stories come about beavers being ferocious monsters. But luckily, they're a lot nicer than that. But again, it just shows there's cultural references there as well. And so coming on sort of to beavers and sort of are actual beavers, not the Evanc. So they are rodents. They're the largest rodent we have in the northern hemisphere. Unlike other rodents, though, they're social monogamous creatures. So they'll pair for life and form a family group within that pair. So a family group can consist of 2 or 3 generations of young. A baby beaver is called a kit. They're also very slow breeders. So they only have 1 litter per year. With an average of about 2 or 3 young within that litter. The offspring will stay with their family group until around 2 years old, 3 years old. At this age, when they reach sexual maturity, they may disperse off to go and find a family group of their own, find a mate of their own, to start their own family group. And so sort of it begins again. Although on some occasions you may get some offspring, although they reach 2 years old, may decide they don't want to leave their family home. They'll stay within their family group and help their parents raise the next generation of young. When that happens, we don't have to worry about interbreeding, because it's only ever the dominant male and female that do the breeding. They suppress any breeding with any youngsters within their family group. So even if you've got a youngster that's at 2 years old, it's not going to breed with its brother or sister or its parent. It will wait until it's dispersed off to find a new mate before creating a family group. They're long-lived, pretty long-lived creatures, so they can live about 10 plus years. They are, however, very territorial. So in their family group, they're really happy. It's a very close-knit social bond, but they don't tolerate any neighbouring beavers. So they will scent mark around their territory to ward off any beavers. And if a strange beaver does come into their territory, they will fight and see them off. It's only other beavers that they're territorial with. Any other wildlife, otters, water voles, any birds that might be around, they're very happy with other wildlife being in the area. It's just other beavers they're not too happy with. They're semi-aquatic and very well known for being semi-aquatic, so very well adapted for life in the water. We've seen a few videos of beavers being in the water, being very adapting their environments. So a bit like otters, eyes, ears, nose are on top of their heads. So when they first emerge into the water, they can have a good look around, check it's nice and safe before they go out doing their day-to-day stuff. They have very small eyesight, so they spend a majority of their time sort of out during the evenings, but despite that, their eyesight is not very good, it's very poor. What they're really relying on is their sense of smell and their hearing. And sense of smell is great for scent marking and smelling around their territory, making it sure it's nice and safe. I've got a few props on the table, feel free to have a look after the talk. They have a really thick fur, really thick underfur, and then sort of lots of guard hairs on top to keep themselves nice and warm in that cold water, and also keeps their skin waterproof as well. Webbed hind feet for swimming in the water, a paddle-shaped tail for helping to swim through the water, propel themselves through the water, but also balancing in shallow water as well. So all of these things sort of really help beavers sort of adapt to their aquatic lifestyle. They are herbivores, so despite what people might think, there's various, well, I'm still surprised at how many people believe that beavers eat fish, even now, but they're entirely herbivorous. And they do have a very wide dietary range. So they do have a very seasonal diet. So in summertime, they eat a lot of greenery, grasses, herbaceous plants, leaves off trees, aquatic plants. And then in winter, when that greenery is dying away, that's when they switch to a more wooded diet. It's deciduous trees that they prefer, aspen, willow, birch in particular amongst their favourites, and it's the bark of the trees that they like. So it's all the sugars within the bark that they're really after, and that's why they're stripping the bark of the tree. They're not great at climbing, so hence why they have to fell trees to get to that bark and any leaves that are on the trees as well. But the species that they like do grow back, they do coppice. So although it might look like devastation and the tree's been cut, okay, top part of the tree will die off, the root system's still intact, so you will get new regrowth coming through. And in the winter as well, they will create a food store, or a food cache as it's known, and this is just a stockpile of particularly of wooded material that they'll take into their water, sink it down in their water body, and so the idea is if the lake or pond freezes over during the winter time, they got food to keep them going, and they just have to come out of the lodge, take some food and go back home again. They don't need to come up on the surface. In Britain, we have a slightly milder climate, so you will get food caches being built, but not to the extent you may see in other places like Canada or Scandinavia, where the food caches they create can keep them going for 5 months over the winter. So they are really adaptable animals. There is some planning there. They really know what they're doing. And so just some footage of a beaver just feeding. So they have their front paws. They're very dexterous, and they will use their front paws quite a bit, and will hold sort of small sticks and twizzle it around almost like corn on the cob to get to all that bark. Or it's a very small stick, they'll just nibble the whole thing. As I mentioned, they're active at dawn and dusk, so they're crepuscular. So come out in early evenings, and they'll be out at various points throughout the night. So we often refer to them as crepuscular rather than nocturnal because they'll have bouts of activity. They'll come out, feed, may chop down a tree, build a dam, do some repair work, and they may go back to bed for a bit and then come out again, and there'll be a bout of activity around dawn just before they go back to bed. And they're engineers, well known for being engineers, and the main thing that they're constructing are lodges or burrows and dams. So the top picture and the bottom picture are just some photos of lodges. So these are resting and breeding places. So basically a lodge is a burrow that's dug into a bank and then topped with mud and sticks to provide a bigger chamber to provide some protection. There'll be a big chamber within that lodge, and if they have a big beaver family, there may be multiple chambers for the youngsters to have as well. There may be a feeding chamber, and there'll always be multiple entrances going from those chambers into the water. So their entrance always goes into the water because that's where they feel nice and safe. They rarely go more than 20 metres away from the water's edge. They are really sort of ingrained at being sort of near a water body. They may also build burrows, which are just burrowed into a bank, which may not be topped off with material. So they're a lot harder to find, but essentially they're the same thing, resting site, a breeding site. And then we have beaver dams. So the main reason beavers build dams is because they like nice stable water bodies. They like water at least a metre deep. So if they move into an area where the water might be quite shallow, that's the reason they build the dam. And it's only really small streams and tributaries where they're building a dam. They don't need to do it on a fast-moving river. So the main river Wye, for example, there's no point building a dam on there. It's a waste of energy because it's just going to get washed away, and it's deep enough already. They have no need to dam those rivers. It's mainly your smaller streams and tributaries going into those main rivers that they're looking to build a dam, and it's only if they have to as well. And we'll talk a bit more about dams in a few more slides. That's just kind of just a very brief overview in terms of beaver ecology. Beaver habitat, so essentially what beavers are after is they're a freshwater species. They need it on a daily basis. You will sometimes find beavers in estuarine conditions. They may use it for foraging or to disperse into a new catchment, but they do need to have access to fresh water. They can't stay in that brackish water or salt water for long. So it's your river systems, it's your ponds, your lakes is where beavers are going to be found. And it's the riparian zone that they like. So that all that feeding in that riparian zone, and the bigger the riparian zone, the better. So it provides opportunities, habitat for beavers for feeding, but also for building their lodges or burrows. They prefer slow-moving water, so while they can be found in your main river systems, it's mainly for moving up and down, for foraging, but they rather be in those slow-moving areas. So if you've got a river that's very spatey, they don't like that. They're not so keen on that, and that's why they like building dams, because they like that nice, stable, slow water. And as I mentioned, they like deep water, so depth of at least a metre deep. I mentioned territory. I mentioned that they're very territorial. So an average territory for a beaver is about 3 kilometres of riverbank. So you often refer to it as on a linear basis, but it can vary. It can be as small as 0.5 kilometres or as long as 20 kilometres, and the main determinant of that is habitat quality. So if you've got really good, pristine habitat, then the territories can be very small. If the habitat's more fragmented, that's when the territories are much larger, hence up to 20 kilometres. And beavers are very adaptable animals. They will generate their own habitats as well. They generate habitats to suit their needs. So if they move into an area where there may not be much water, that's when they will start creating a dam or digging canals to allow more water to be held back for themselves. And so they will move into an areas that are great for beavers but not so great for us. Of agricultural landscapes, if they move into drainage ditches, that's ideal for a beaver but not ideal if you're a farmer. And so that's where the conflicts can come in, where beavers move into areas that have human activity, human infrastructure. Urban areas as well, beavers are just as much of an urban animal as they are a rural animal. It's not one or the other. They can adapt. They're found in the middle of city centres. They're right in the middle of Perth. They live in the middle of Munich. They're even found at Munich Airport in some of the balancing ponds around at the airport. So they will adapt to if the habitat's there, they will move into it. So it's a case of if you build it, they will come kind of thing. And as mentioned, they'll alter their habitat to suit their needs. As mentioned, that can cause conflicts, particularly for us, but it can also be really beneficial, creating those wetland areas that can be amazing for other wildlife. And so with that in mind, the beaver is often referred to as a keystone species. And a keystone species is basically an animal that has an inordinate benefit for its local environment, for its surrounding ecosystem. So just through the activity of beavers, from coppicing those trees, creating ponds, by building dams, it's all going to have a knock-on benefit for all lots of wildlife. And it's been found beavers can benefit everything from aquatic plants, terrestrial plants, lichens, bryophytes, insects, other mammals, birds, amphibians and reptiles. There's a whole wealth of other species that do well, and there's lots of evidence to back that up from North America and across Europe as well. Beavers are creating new habitats. It's opening up areas for for new species, creating niches, and so foraging opportunities and breeding opportunities and food opportunities, foraging opportunities for other species as well. And so, yeah, basically they're transforming a landscape through their own activities. And through the next few slides, we're just going to give a snapshot of some of the research that has been conducted looking into this. And so, just going back into what beavers do, so I mentioned coppicing, so that's what beavers are doing when they're cutting down a tree, essentially. When I first started working with beavers, one of the main concerns were beavers are going to come in, they're going to clear fell all our forests, there'll be nothing left. And it's just trying to explain that humans might do that, but beavers and other wildlife are a lot more sensible. If they chop down all the trees, there'll be nothing left for them. But if we look closely at what's happening, there is still life there are still trees growing, they're not killing those trees. So when beavers first move into a habitat, to us it might look unsightly. It might look like devastation, the trees are being cut, it might look like everything's dead. But as I mentioned, the top of the trees have died off, but the root system is still intact. And with that, when those trees like willow and birch are cut, that stump is then putting a lot more energy into its roots. And eventually you're going to get new growth root coming through. And then if that's left, that root growth becomes a lot more established, and then that's going to provide more food for beavers. It's also going to provide homes for other animals. So this coppice can be great for small mammals and birds, ground nesting birds can move into it. If we look closely at beaver habitat, you've got a rotation that's happening. You've got some trees that are newly cut, but you've got other trees that are a lot more established. And so that you get a mosaic of different habitats within that woodland that maybe just at one stage just all the same age and all the same height. We get age structure and we're getting sort of height structure into that as well. And so essentially it's what we used to do as woodland managers. We used to coppice our woodlands. So did we learn from beavers using these techniques to manage our woodlands, and by doing that you're actually increasing the life of the woodlands as well. And then going back to beaver dams, so I mentioned that beavers create dams to suit their needs. It's holding back water. Beaver dams come in all different shapes and sizes. It all depends on what the landscape is like. You may get some dams that are quite short but very tall. You may get some that are very long but not very high. So beaver dam could be a metre high, 2 metres high, or it may just be as low as 0.5 metres. It all depends on what the landscape is like. But what it does do, it does hold water back. But beaver dams are made of mud and sticks. They will let water through. They are semi-permeable, so they're not that blockage that people worry about. So as described in the film, they're not going to block all our river systems. It's not going to stop migratory fish going upstream or downstream. There will be bypass channels around those dams and going over the dams. And with that, there's been lots of research looking into sort of the benefits beaver dams can have on our landscape for the wildlife. And so going sort of to Bavaria, so again, as mentioned in the film, beavers were introduced into Bavaria in the 1960s. So it's a really good place to look at where beavers have been established over decades and sort of the management systems developed over those years as well. It's also a great place to look at study sites. So this is one of the areas, so I've been lucky enough to go to Bavaria a few times, taking small groups of people out there from Wales to look at the impact beavers have had on the landscape and look at sort of the benefits other wildlife have had as well. So one of the study sites we go to is a 10-mile sort of long valley that's had beavers there for about 20 years. And the Yuli Messenger, who is the biologist with the umbrella, he's been studying this site for over 10 years now, looking at sort of the impact beavers have had on the landscape. And it's a valley system that it was a valley that it's lots of agriculture in this area. Bavaria is a very agricultural landscape. The local farmer tried to drain the land on a regular basis, but found he was fighting a losing battle. In the end, decided to leave it, and the site returned back into a wetland valley, and then beavers started to move in, and they really transformed this landscape. But what's really nice about this site is you've got beavers in the valley bottom that's not suitable for farming, but you've still got farming in the surrounding area, and there's forestry as well. So it shows that you can have all the things in the same area. It doesn't have to be one or the other. So you usually look at a whole different range of wildlife, but I've just taken a snapshot of some of the things that we've been looking at. So looking at breeding birds and invertebrates. So with the breeding birds, he's been looking at not just wetland birds, but also woodland birds as well. And he found over the years as beavers moved in, So the blue bar is sort of when there's minor beaver activity, just maybe a few beavers, not much is happening. But over time, when beaver numbers start to increase, there's more activity going on. He found that's when you had an increase in abundance of different abundance of birds, but also an increase in bird species as well. And in 2016, he found that redback striped had moved into this area for the very first time. And about 2 years ago, they found there's now 3 breeding pairs of redback stripe. So just because the different habitats being created and the connectivity with the habitat is allowing new species to move in. And even when the beavers move off, so the green bar, the beaver numbers may have decreased slightly, but the infrastructure is still intact, such as the beaver dams. You've still got regrowth coming from the coppicing. There's still benefits for the wildlife in the area as well. So you may not have quite the increase in bird numbers, but there's still more there than there were before beavers had moved into the site. And with invertebrates, similar when there's sort of minor beaver activity, the blue bar, and when there's more, lots of beaver activity going on the red bar, we found that there was a huge increase in dragonfly numbers and species. And with dragonflies, this has been found right across the board, mainly just because the amount of water that's now available for the larvae, but also for the adult stage as well, the terrestrial habitats that's required. And so there's a range of different species that can really benefit from beaver habitats. And moving closer to home, going to Devon Wildlife Trust. So in 2010, 2011, Devon Wildlife Trust started an Enclosure Beaver project, and it's about 3 hectare area that they fenced off, and released a pair of beavers in 2011. So one of the things they were looking at is amphibians, and so just as a very basic study, they started counting frog spawn clumps. And so in 2011, the year the beavers were released, they only counted 10 clumps of frog spawn. By the end of 2017, they recorded over 600 clumps of frog spawn in that site. And it's mainly just because of the amount of water that was now in that site that the amphibians were taking hold and just went a bit crazy. And speaking to colleagues sort of a few years after that, they were saying they noticed a lot more, they noticed grass snakes moving into the area and a lot more otter activity that hadn't been recorded previously. And that's just because the amount of amphibians available, that food source now available, new species were moving in. And sticking with Devon and just looking at sort of a different sort of context to having a beaver site or a beaver enclosure. So they noticed that the site was changing, and they noticed the hydrology of the site was changing, which wasn't something that they initially had thought about when they released beavers into the enclosure. The idea was to release beavers as a habitat management tool. So the beaver enclosures in this woodland, and they were just trying to control the woodland to allow sort of grassland species to come in and just create a bit more of a mosaic of a habitat. And the site is surrounded by lots of farmland, and the site itself is owned by a farmer. So that was fenced off and to monitor the habitat changes. But then they noticed that things were changing with the flow rates in that site, and so they commissioned University of Exeter to look at the site more closely, and so and this provided an opportunity to look at the hydrology changes that were taking place. So this is just a diagram of what the site looked like prior to beavers being released into the enclosure. So the 3 hectare enclosure basically just included a very small stream going through the site. I think it was only around 150 metres long, with one pond in the middle. So a deep pond, and that was a beaver release pond. Nice deep water, and it was kind of sort of that was what the beavers had. But over time, the beavers decided it wasn't quite enough water for them, and so they set about changing the site. So over the years, the site was mapped looking at the changes in that water flow. And so the grey is the water flow, and then the black lines are beaver dams. So over years, you'll notice those black lines are increasing, so that by the end of 2016, 13 beaver dams have been created in that site. And as the number of beaver dams increased, the volume of water on site started increasing, and the water not only started flowing downstream, it was also going sideways as well, because the water was being held back. By doing that, it was creating beaver ponds behind those beaver dams. So you're getting a much more dynamic wetland than the small stream that started off. at the beginning of the project. And they also found that the water table had increased as well. So not just only the surface water, the water table had increased. And so if you look at what's happening to the flow rate, so University of Exeter was studying above the beaver dams, and below the beaver dams they had monitor stations. The good thing about this site is just one inflow and one outflow, so you can get some really good measurements from that. And so the blue bar is the amount of water flowing in the site, red bar is the amount of water flowing out of the site. So they measured it over 6 years, had these monitoring stations up throughout the year, so you could look at different weather events. And so when there was really heavy rainfall, the amount of water flowing in was a lot higher than the amount of water flowing out. And so what they were finding is those beaver dams, although they will let water through, were holding back the water enough that was slowing the water flow going through that site. So potentially, if rather than water just rushing down, that slowing of the flow of water was enough to potentially help with reducing the risk of downstream flooding. And then on the other side of that, in summertime, when conditions are a lot drier or even drought conditions, they were finding the opposite was happening. So you had little or no water flowing in, but the amount of water flowing out was higher, and that's because these beaver dams were slowly leaching out the water, and so you still had water flowing downstream. And so that potential benefits there, if you've got other wildlife or livestock further downstream, you've still got water within that system. So where some systems were drying up, this system still had water in. And I think a couple of years ago there were some visuals that have come out from Devon, from Clinton Devon Estate on the River Otter, where they have wild beavers on their estate, and there's a drone footage of over the wetland site, over where the beavers were, which was luscious green fields, river system, and then the surrounding fields where there were no beavers were just parched, they were just bone dry. So it just shows by having sort of water kept in the system how it can sustain the water going forwards in really dry conditions when some areas are drying up. So potentially knock-on benefits and on both sides of the system. And as we're seeing now with the unpredictability of climate change, we are seeing more extremes, very wet winters and very dry summers. Maybe beavers can potentially help with some of our nature-based solutions, looking at some of the issues that we are facing. Exeter University have looked at other sites as well, and are receiving very similar results from those other study sites. So it's not just sort of a one-off result from this site in Devon. Very similar results are being found elsewhere. They also looked, as mentioned, they noticed the water storage had increased, so they measured the volume of water and the surface water. So as you can tell, and as you expect, by increasing the number of dams, it's increasing the number of water on site. So the water storage does increase. It obviously does plateau off once the beavers have built all the dams that they need to, and that's also taken into account evaporation as well. It is worth bearing in mind, though, that this is an enclosure, so the amount of dams that beavers can build are limited by that enclosure, and the spacing between the dams will vary as well. If it was a wider catchment and we're looking at upper catchment, you may not necessarily get dams as close together, you may not have as many, or you may have more. So it's just obviously there is that caveat with it, but the results coming out from this are sort of a really good sort of basis looking at what beavers might do in subcatchments or our catchments themselves. They also looked at water quality. So as I mentioned, this site is surrounded by farmland and it is prone to diffuse pollution, unfortunately. And so they had monitors, again, above the dams and below the dams, and they're looking at the water quality above and below. And what they noticed, the amount of sediments and nutrients, in this case it was nitrates and phosphates, were a lot higher above the dams and below the dams. So the blue bar here, a lot more nutrients below the dams, and then the red bar, the nutrients were lower. So potentially those beaver dams were helping to filter out water. So what's happening is the beaver dams are holding back the sediment, and by doing that the nutrients are holding onto those sediments and then settling out at the base of the ponds, and so your water flowing through the dams are it's a lot clearer or a better quality below the dams. Obviously you're not going to get rid of the nutrients completely, but at least the water below the dams are going to be slightly better quality than above the dams. It was found as well that the nutrient-loving plants are moving into these sites as well, so potentially helping to take off some of those nutrients as well. But as I mentioned, there is still going to be some nutrients in the system, but at least it's potentially helping with some of the issues we're facing. The one thing they did notice, though, is that the dissolved organic carbon was higher below the dams and above the dams, but that's because you've got wooded debris coming back in. It is decaying in the system, so as Rashim said, you have got the wood in the video, you have got the wood dying and decaying, but that's all sort of natural parcel of the sort of the beaver ecosystem, and there are organisms in that wetland system that do need that dissolved organic carbon. And what's been found in some sites that potentially beaver wetlands could help with storing some of our carbon as well. So potentially there's carbon storage opportunities there as well. There's a lot more research being conducted in that area, but it's showing that again there are other potential benefits from having beavers in our ecosystem as well. And it was found, I think Exeter University found that I think the amount of sediment that was held back was about 7% of the sediment was held back within this beaver system. And so just to give a visual of the water quality on this site, so you've got the water quality above the dams and the water quality below the dams. So as you can tell, it's a lot clearer. Probably still want to drink the water below the dam, but it's going to be a lot better than above. So if you are desperate and dying of thirst, always go below the dams. And just to give a visual, or just sort of an illustration of what a beaver habitat can look like, and sort of the take home really is, it's not a one-size-fits-all. It's a very dynamic, complex, diverse habitat that's constantly changing. And this is just from a paper just showing what can happen if you beaver movers into the system and you let beavers just get on with it. So what they basically do, they're changing a very incised river system to something that's a lot more complex. So going from water that's just flowing downstream to increasing that riverbed or that wetland riparian zone, reconnecting the river with its riparian zone and just creating a lot more dynamic river system. So creating a dam and that sort of widens the channel. Dams sometimes they will degrade, sometimes beavers will repair them, sometimes they leave them, and that changes sort of the water flow as well. And so you get the river widening, but then it may narrow again, and then over time just getting a more and more complex system where you get more trees coming in, other plants coming in, ponds being created, online ponds, offline ponds, and it's, as I mentioned, it's constantly changing. And then you may get a point where beavers decide to move off from that system, move on elsewhere. You may get this sedimenting up, and then you get new vegetation coming through and new wildlife coming through, and when that happens it's often referred to a beaver meadow. So even after beavers move off a site, there are still changes happening and beavers still having that impact, even though they may not be there. There's still positive impacts happening with other wildlife coming in. And so although beavers are really beneficial in terms of for the environmental and ecological benefits, the beaver themselves was also a highly prized animal. So much so this was a state of beavers by the late 19th century. So unfortunately beavers were hunted to extinction by the 16th century they were extinct from Britain. It was thought beavers went extinct just after the Middle Ages in Wales, and by the 16th century across England and Scotland. And this is a state where beavers were found by the late 19th century. So that map that was once red, this is a state of beavers, just 4 isolated populations across Europe and 8 isolated populations right across Europe and Asia. So reduced down to 1,200 individual animals. So it's amazing that we were able to even hold on to that, because it's possible we could have lost them completely. The reason being, as I mentioned, they're a highly prized animal, so it's not because they were considered a pest, it was what beavers could offer us. So again, got a beaver pelt on the table. So one of the things beavers were utilised for were their fur. So hunted for their fur for making hats and coats. They were hunted for their meat, so for feeding. In 16th century Europe, the Catholic Church considered beavers to be a fish, so it could be eaten on abstinence days. So pretty much every part of a beaver was utilised. I think they considered beavers to be a fish because of it. They lived in water and have a scaly tail, so therefore must be a fish. Teeth and claws were used for jewellery. I mentioned they're really territorial. One thing beavers have castoreum glands, which contains castoreum oil, and that's what they use for scent marking. And so that castoreum gland was highly sought after for medicinal purposes. It's thought that the castoreum oil could cure headaches or coughs, colds, arthritis, you name it, they thought it could cure it. However, although beavers may not have been able to cure everything, there may be some truth in that castoreum oil, because it's been shown that one of the ingredients in castoreum is salicylic acid. And if you look at the back of an aspirin packet, that's the actual ingredient in aspirin. And so there probably was some truth in beavers having painkilling potential. So if you had a headache, maybe that castoreum have cured it. Who knows? I don't know who the first person was to discover that, but someone did, and so that didn't help the beaver's plight, and it was thought that castoreum glands could pay a hunter's wages for over a year. So you can see why people wanted to go for beavers. Are highly sought after. Every part of a beaver was utilised, so I guess it wasn't wasted, but unfortunately just unsustainably hunted, and that led to their demise, unfortunately, across Britain and a majority of Europe. However, this is the present day distribution of beavers. So on this map, the black dots are those relic populations, those isolated populations by the end of the late 19th century. Sorry, and the red shading is areas where beavers have been actively translocated, reintroduced, and natural dispersal as well. So you can see that they are starting to make a comeback across Europe and Asia. You may notice a bit of green shading across Finland and Russia, and that has a label Castor canadensis. And if you remember from the first slide, that's a Latin name for the North American beaver. So some of the earlier introductions took place in the 1920s, particularly in Scandinavia. And in the 1930s, beavers were brought over from North America to help with the reintroduction plight. Back then, it was thought that they were the same species. They looked very similar. And so North America had a lot more beavers than we had in Europe, so brought them over to help with the reintroduction plight. However, through the advances of science, we now know that they are two different species through genetics, and so now they are trying to control the North American beaver to allow them in Finland and Russia to allow the natural dispersal of the Eurasian beaver. As I mentioned, though, if the two species were to meet, we don't have to worry about interbreeding. We're not going to get hybrids with the two species, so we don't have to worry about that. But it's just to provide, by managing the North American beaver, it's providing opportunity for our native species, the Eurasian beaver, to get dispersed back into its former home range. In terms of which species is stronger, it's really difficult. There is no sort of set rule. In some areas, the North American beaver outcompetes the Eurasian beaver. In other areas, it's the opposite way round. So there's probably local dynamics going on in those areas. So it is quite complex. But as I said, they are trying to manage the North American beaver. The first reintroductions started in the 1920s. More recent reintroductions are based on conservation purposes. So the early reintroductions were to bring back a lost species. Now it's to bring back a species that can help with other conservation efforts, that can help with other species, for the ecological and environmental benefits of beavers. And as you may notice on Britain, we have got some red dots on there. So this is where we're going to go to next. And so I'm going to give a recap of what's been happening right across Britain. So some of this was mentioned in the film earlier. So starting off with Scotland, so Scotland sort of have really been leading the way with beaver introductions. So some of the early consultations started in the 1990s. It is worth noting, though, that beaver introduction discussions have been going on since the 1970s in Britain. So just to put in context how long it's taken us to get to this point. But I mentioned Scotland have been leading the way. Early consultation started in the 1990s, and in 2009 we saw the very first beaver introduction trial to Britain. So that happened in Knapdale Forest in Argyll, and that was a Scottish beaver trial. So that was a partnership project with the Scottish Wildlife Trust, Royal Zoological Society of Scotland, and it took place on Forestry Commission land. So it's a 5-year project to look at beavers back in the wild, and so it was a scientific trial. Lots of studies were undertaken to see how beavers can fare in our landscape. However, no one told the beavers that, because shortly afterwards in 2010, some beavers were officially discovered on the River Tay catchment on the east part of Scotland, so on the opposite side of the country. That caused a bit of debate at the time, so some people wanted those beavers to be removed because they're unofficially released. But then again, you're trying to reintroduce beavers to the other side of the country, so you're trying to release them, reintroduce them, and then get rid of them. It just didn't quite make sense. Eventually, though, it was decided that beavers were allowed to stay on the Tay catchment and could be studied alongside the Scottish Beaver trial. So essentially, both the Scottish Beaver trial and the beavers on the River Tay were studied over a 5-year period. And in a way, it provided an opportunity to look at different habitats, because the Tay catchment the lower part of the catchment is very agricultural, whereas in Argyll it's very mountainous, lots of lochans, so very different landscapes. So it was in a way good to compare the two different landscapes. When the trial finished in 2014, a final report was put together and submitted to the Scottish Government, which outlined various scenarios for the future of beavers in Scotland. It took a while for Scottish Government to sort of decide on the future of beavers in Scotland, but in 2016 they announced they were minded to allow beavers to stay in Scotland, but hadn't really made a decision. It was just they're minded to. So it was still unknown what was happening with the beavers in Tayside and also the beavers in Knapdale. But eventually in 2019, the Scottish Government decided that both beaver populations could stay. Beavers granted legal protections, became a European protected species and recognised a native species once again. With that came a management strategy as well, looking at the future of beavers in Scotland. So while beavers can have many benefits, sometimes there can be conflicts with human infrastructure and activities. Particularly, they were finding more of the conflicts around the Tay catchment, and so they're looking at ways that they can mitigate against some of those impacts, and so some of the mitigation techniques that we saw earlier in the previous video. And so sort of with that became the management system along with the protected status. For a while though, no other beavers were allowed to be released elsewhere in Scotland, but that's changed over the years. So more recently, the next sort of release into the wild was Agati red kites. Were allowed to release beavers onto their land, and more recently we've had beaver releases, reintroductions in Cairngorm National Park, and as of a few weeks ago into Glen Affric as well. So the beavers are now being moved to other areas in Scotland, which is great news, and sort of increasing those areas and the numbers. Coming over to England, so the very first beaver project in England started in 2001. It was an enclosed beaver project in Kent. So it's looking at putting beavers onto fenland habitat and looking at using beavers as a habitat management tool. And that was with Kent Wildlife Trust. And then shortly afterwards, in 2008, feasibility studies were completed across England to look at bringing beavers back into the wild, reintroducing beavers into the wild. However, a bit like Scotland, wild beavers were discovered in Devon, so were discovered on the River Otter. Again, a bit of unknown to how they got there, but Devon Wildlife Trust saw as an opportunity to bring these beavers into an official reintroduction trial. At this point, Devon Wildlife Trust had the Beaver Enclosure, which was on the other side of the county to the River Otter. So they applied for a licence to Natural England, and that was granted to Devon Wildlife Trust to turn the beavers on the River Otter into official project, and that became the River Otter Beaver Trial. So a 5-year trial that was scientifically studied. When that finished, a science and evidence report was published, sort of outlining all the results that have been collated and sort of outlining future scenarios. And in 2020, later that year, the then Environment Minister announced that beavers were allowed to stay on the River Otter, were allowed to spread, were allowed to disperse and breed. However, it did leave a bit of unknown for other beavers, because during this time there's been, between 2001 to beavers and have the benefits and minimise those negative impacts. And so looking at what we've been doing over the years, we've looked at various potential release sites over the years. We've had a number of setbacks over the years, but more recently we've been looking at the Dovey catchment for a wild release. And the Dovey catchment is also home to Montgomeryshire Wildlife Trust Caws Dovey Nature Reserve, which is here. And so part of my work is not only looking at wild releases, but it's also advising on enclosed beaver projects as well. And so Montgomeryshire Wildlife Trust for a number of years have been looking at having beavers on their nature reserve at Caws Dovey Nature Reserve or the Dovey Wildlife Centre, which is more famous for having ospreys, but they've been looking at ways to manage their reserve. So it's an enclosed beaver site with one beaver family, and basically it's the restoration of a lowland peat bog. And unfortunately the site's been mismanaged over the decades, and prior to Montgomeryshire Wildlife Trust owning it, it was a conifer plantation, and conifer on a peat bog just doesn't go. It's damaged the site, and so when the Wildlife Trust took it on, they've been looking at ways that they can sort of basically restore that lowland peat bog. They clear-felled the conifer plantation, but unfortunately willow and birch scrub just took hold faster than anything else could come through. And so for the past 20 or 30 years, Montgomeryshire Wildlife Trust have been trying to manage that lowland bog. They've been trying to do it with sort of volunteers and staff going out there with chainsaws and loppers, but they're finding as soon as they cut down the willow, it grows back. Also trying to get into the heart of the peat bog is dangerous. You've got the legacy of old forestry, drainage ditches, and so for health and safety wise, it's just not feasible or practical. They've looked at using water buffalo over the years, and the water buffalo did a fantastic job, really helped with controlling the willow and birch scrub. But they found as the buffalo got older, they were only tending to go for the new regrowth, they won't go for the more established willow. And so it kind of became a sort of a light bulb moment. If only there was something that liked willow and liked water. And so that's where beavers came to sort of the forefront, came to the drawing board. And so that's why Montgomeryshire Wildlife Trust started looking at beavers as a habitat management tool, as a conservation grazer. And so that's why I've come in with them and been advising them on sort of building a beaver enclosure, so like the size of the enclosure, what habitat requirements the beavers need, putting in sort of funding and sort of license applications together. And also just to emphasise that beavers in enclosure, the management of beavers in enclosure is very different to a beaver introduction into the wild. You've basically got animals in captivity, although they behave as they would in the wild, they would behave like a wild animal. They are enclosed, so you have got that animal welfare element and responsibility with it. And so when we started looking at this project, the reserve is about 120 acres. This is the majority of the reserve. Some of it goes over the railway line, and the ospreys are on the other side of the railway. So when they asked me for my advice, my initial thought was it would be fantastic just to let beavers have whole reign of the whole nature reserve, just put a fence around the outskirts. Ideally would love to have beavers out in the wild, but licensing for a wild release is a lot more complex. And also for Montgomeryshire Wildlife Trust, they wanted the beavers to stay on the reserve because they want them to do a particular job. And so that's why we started looking at having an enclosure. Unfortunately, though, the cost of fencing is quite expensive, and the cost of beaver fencing is even more expensive. So you do have to have bespoke beaver fencing. And so with that, we had to look at a much smaller area. And so with the funding available, we're only able to sort of fence off a smaller area. So it was in the end, it became a 3-hectare enclosure that was fenced. But the idea was if more funding becomes available, we could expand that fence if we need to. So as you can see, we've gone through an area. It's got 3 interconnected ponds with lots of habitat around it. This site is all ground sort of water fed, so there isn't a defined inflow or outflow. So what we have is basically just 3 sort of stable water bodies. And so what we're seeing at this site, what we see from this site is sort of slightly different from beaver activity at other sites. But mentioned, applied for funding, built a fence, applied for a licence, and eventually we're allowed to release beavers. So in 2021, beavers were released into the enclosure. So we worked closely with Beaver Trust to source the beavers from Scotland, and Roisin came down and transported our first beavers across. It was a beaver family, father, son, and then mum came a few weeks later. A very happy beaver family. They've bred over the years, and the son, which is this one here, we moved him off down to Cornwall 2 years ago now. So he was 18 months when he arrived, and then he was 4 years old when he left. So had reached sexual maturity, but stayed on a little bit longer because he wasn't showing signs of wanting to go. But then a couple of years ago, we moved him down because there was a lone female in Cornwall that needed a mate, and he was a good compatible for her. So we moved him down to Cornwall. He's now successfully bred with a beaver at Lost Gardens of Heligan, and now they have their own beaver family. And so partly one of the reasons we did move him off, partly because he was showing signs of wanting to go, but also that year the original male, the original female unfortunately passed away, and so we're left with sort of an adult male without a female. So we moved off the older youngster, partly because he wanted to go, but also if you trying to bring new animals in, because they're very territorial, they may not tolerate a sort of a whole beaver family. So by doing that, it made the original male sort of on his own, and we could bring a new female in. And so October last year, a new female was found for our original male, and she came from the Eurasian Beaver Project. So it's a 2-year-old female from Eurasian Beaver Project, was a youngster with them, and so she was moved off and is paired up with our original male. So we've been monitoring them very carefully. They seem to be getting on, so we're keeping our fingers crossed that maybe they'll successfully breed this year. So it's kind of watch this space with what might happen with the beavers at Corstovey. So now's mating season, so hopefully she could be pregnant, and so we'll keep a close eye on her over the next few weeks and see what happens. But essentially the beavers themselves, so the reason they're there is basic habitat management, so making sure when you release beavers into any area is the habitat suitable, so very deep water, lots of vegetation, and so we've been doing monitoring over the years. We've been doing ecological monitoring as well as observing the beavers quite closely, and so they've been doing what we want them to do. They've been coppicing the willow, the vegetation, and we've noticed over the years that there are now gaps in the canopy. There is regrowth coming through, so we realise we're never going to get rid of the willow completely, but the gaps the beavers have created has provided opportunities for new vegetation to come through. So hopefully that's going to restore the lowland peat bog vegetation. We've had consultancies come and do surveys for us. We've also had students from Aberystwyth University come and do vegetation surveys, invertebrate surveys as well. And so we're sort of building up sort of information from this site, and we found over the years that the biodiversity of the site has increased through the beaver activity. They're creating feeding stations and creating canals, and they've definitely at home they've created their own lodge, which is very difficult to find at first. We found it as vegetation died off the first winter, and the beaver lodge was right in the middle of the enclosure, and the only way you could get to it is by swimming across or taking a rowing boat. So they made themselves nice and home and secure and away from us, but we're certainly very happily settling into their new home. And just to give a visual of what the beavers have been doing, so here are the 3 interconnected ponds. There is a channel around the outside of the enclosure, and this channel is a man-made channel that was created to create enough sort of flat area for the beaver fence to go in, and that created a channel on the outside. But that does create sort of a connectivity from these ponds going right around the enclosure. But what we found through sort of our monitoring sort of on the ground and also from aerial footage, as the beavers have certainly been very busy. So those the original water prior to the beavers being released, but this is what the beavers have been up to over the years. So these yellow lines are the canals that beavers have created into their enclosure. So with this site, as I mentioned, there's no defined inflow or outflow going through it, so we don't have a stream going through, it's all ground fed. And because it's stable water bodies, the beavers have no need to build dams. So as I mentioned, they only build dams if the water's shallow or not deep enough. This water each pond is over 1 metre deep. In some areas, I think it's about 2 or 3 metres deep. So they have nice deep water. We've been looking at water levels over the years, but the water generally remains quite stable, just tends to fluctuate with high rainfall. And there is tidal influence from the main river, Dovey, coming through. But that's the only time the water level fluctuates. The rest of the time, it's nice and stable for them, so they don't need to change the water levels, but they are able to increase the amount of water by creating canals and channels, and that's what we see in lots of sites. So beavers, as an engineer, are just as much an excavator. They're a burrowing animal and still will create more wetlands by creating these canal systems. And I can see they're radiating out. So a lot of their activity has been around here. They're central based foragers. Their beaver lodge is in this area here. So a lot of activity has been around their beaver lodge. But as they've expanded, as they started feeding on these areas, they're now starting to expand out. They've been there for 5 years, and this is the activity where their activity's been. So it's only now that they're starting to move out into other areas. So it's 3 hectare enclosure, but they've only stayed in one corner. Over the years, we may see them move out further and further and expand their range into the rest of the enclosure. So it just shows, if you've got the right habitat, how close-knit they can be around their lodge and just move out as and when they need to. They haven't sort of rampaged around the whole enclosure. They're sort of being very systematic about it. And we often refer to them as choosy generalists. They have like a system in mind, but they're also very generalist as well as they go about their daily foraging.
Just a few more minutes.
Okay.
That'd be great.
Oh, yeah.
Leave some time for questions.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. We're almost near the end anyway. So, and so just to sort of to recap, so the beavers at Course Dovey, they're an enclosed beaver project. It's a habitat management management project, but the work here can feed into our wider work. So the information we're gathering from Course Dovey, the ecological information, public engagement opportunities can really help with our wider work. So the main objective of the Welsh Beaver Project is for a beaver reintroduction into wild and to see beavers accepted as a native species once again. We've done, as mentioned, lots of national and local consultations, and these discussions will be ongoing. And part of it, we have set up local beaver management groups and sort of beaver management network to demonstrate and ensure that any negative impacts can be managed. And so we get the positive benefits of beavers and sort of the negative issues are managed and mitigated. Things are starting to change in Wales, so Wales has been behind the curve. We're sort of further behind with beaver introductions or establishment of beavers, but times are changing. A couple of years ago, Welsh Government announced their support for the reintroduction of beavers to Wales. Last year, they announced that they would grant beavers protection in Wales. And then, as of yesterday, that protection came into force. So beavers, as of yesterday, are now European protected species in Wales and finally recognised as a native species. So for us, that's a huge win. It's taken a long time to get to that point. It now means legislation is aligned across England, Scotland and Wales. So if beavers are crossing borders, they have the same protection. It can really help with the restoration of beavers across Wales as well as across Britain. So part of our work, we applied for a licence for a beaver introduction on the River Dovey catchment. We've resubmitted that licence. Bit similar theme to Scotland and England. Beavers have already turned up on the River Dovey, so they're beating us to it. While all the politics takes a long time, beavers are just getting on with it. So we've applied for a licence for population reinforcement on the River Dovey. It's a very small number of beavers, and we want them to become an established or a sustainable beaver population. So that's sort of our plans going forwards. And in due course, Natural Resources Wales will lead on a national public consultation on our licence application. And we're hoping eventually we'll be able to look at other sites for beaver reintroductions or re-establishment. So, and just to recap or summarise sort of the pros and cons of enclosures versus wild release, and just the similarities with both. Feasibility studies are required for both situations, but with a wild release site you do have to take in the whole catchment into consideration. Licence is required for both an enclosure and a wild release, although for a wild release, the wild, bit of a typo there. So wild release into the wild, there's a lot more work is required. It's a lot more lengthy process. Enclosures you do need to consult, but only with neighbours because it's basically on your land. Beavers are enclosed, are not going to go too far. With a wild release you do need a wider consultation, basically consult with the whole catchment, if not wider afield than that. For an enclosure though, animal welfare and husbandry considerations do need to be considered, taken on board, because you've got animals in captivity, so animal welfare legislation comes into that. Whereas with the wild, the animals are going to be a wild animal, but there may be some monitoring and management may be required, but it's going to be different to what happens with an enclosure. And in terms of costs, with an enclosure, you've got fencing costs, staff costs, time costs. Fencing costs can be very expensive depending on the size of enclosure. Staff costs, with wild release, you've got staff costs and time costs mainly, but the licensing process is lengthy, and so that can increase costs along the way. And with both, you've got sourcing beavers and associated costs with that, and more beavers are sourced through the Beaver Trust because they hold the stud book for beavers across Britain, so we can look at sort of compatibility with individuals being released, whether it's an enclosure or into a wild release site. And just sort of to finish and to summarise basically, so overall beavers are a quintessential ecosystem engineer. They create landscape changes and can help restore natural processes to the benefit of many species, including humans. However, mitigation is a vital part of any beaver introduction project, and also beavers just turning up in the wild. We may need to consider mitigation in some areas as well, even outside of reintroduction projects. But overall, beaver re-establishment management policy is essential. With the news yesterday that's from Welsh Government, that's a real big step forwards, and hopefully will help us go forwards and particularly push some of this policy going through. The main thing or main ask or call out to Welsh Government and NRW is, okay, yes, there'll be costs to beaver management, but the benefits of beavers significantly outweigh the costs, and there's lots of evidence to support that as well. So we need to take that on board and be pragmatic about it. And overall, the take-home message really is making space for beavers in our landscape. It's about restoring riparian corridors, creating space for beavers, but that will also create space for other wildlife, protecting our river systems, and overall, in summary, there is a place for beavers in Britain, and it's basically relearning to live alongside them again. It can be done. It's been done in other countries, so going back to Bavaria, 10-mile river valley that has beavers, but you've got farming, you've got forestry, and nearby here there's a small village in town, so you can have it all in the same place. It doesn't have to be one or the other. And there's opportunity for public engagement as well, so you can bring everyone on board and with that. So with Wales, watch this space with beavers. And so hopefully one day they'll be coming near you.